Hello, and welcome to this video on setting your initial transaction priorities. And as you can see, initial is all in caps because I'll mention it many times throughout this video. What we're doing is we're setting what we believe our priorities to be, but those priorities only exist in the context of working with your preferred buyer. In this video, however, you're going to learn how to set your key role structure, your valuation priorities, and then ultimately define the ideal transaction that you would like to have for your business. The topics that we're going to be covering are the 3 transaction priorities. We're going to talk about a framework on how to determine your post-transaction role after you're acquired. We'll talk about which transaction lanes then might be best for you. And then finally, we'll talk about your ideal economics or your transaction levers. Okay, let's get started. There's 3 major transaction priorities that you're going to be thinking about establishing. Now, the first question, as you can see that I ask here, is can you be trusted to have priorities while still focusing on the buyer's needs? Because as I've talked about numerous times in many different videos and training programs that I lead, oftentimes sellers fail to think of the buyer and what their needs are, and that actually hurts them, not helps them. But I'm going to trust that we can still walk through our priorities, but then recognize that we have to listen to a buyer. The first one is your role. How can your role best match the transaction and match what the goals are of the buyer and your own objectives? The second one then is looking at these transaction lanes and seeing which one makes the most sense for you. And then finally, we'll talk through the specific economic levers that you want to prioritize in your transaction. Okay, let's start with the role. Think of your post-transaction role by phase after the acquisition. Immediately after you get done with a closing, while you're thinking about, I just want to sleep and take it easy, you'll recognize that you won't get paid until after, for example, your Amazon account has migrated to the buyer. The migration period is typically about a month, and it focuses on all of the immediate handoff items. That might be contractors or team members. It might be your Amazon account and or other logins, and it might be key supplier purchase orders that you need to get moving forward on. After that, there's what's called a transition role. It's typically a few months in duration, but it's the period where you're transitioning all of the different things over to the buyer. And it's also the period where oftentimes if you decide to go part-time and back off, you're starting to shift from that full-time immediacy of the migration role into the part-time transition role. But then there's really 2 other ways to think about your transaction role by phase. The first one is what I call short-term value creation, which is in year 1. And the way to think about this is essentially continuing the business as if you owned it and making sure that products in the pipeline get launched and get optimized effectively, making sure that your variations or your holiday strategies are put in place, those types of things. And the time commitment's going to vary based on the role. And then separate from that is really the strategic role of long-term value creation, which might be things such as what new product niches should we get into, how are they complementary, where can this brand expand to, and a number of other types of things. It could also be Amazon Marketplace channel expansion to Europe or other places, for example. Okay, now that you see the different roles and the different phases, we want to put together a framework for how to determine your post-transaction role. The first thing that you want to do is you want to think about some of the key questions that you've got. The first one is going to be, what is best for the business and for the buyer? As I said, we're putting our needs behind theirs so that we can design the right deal. Second, what is best for you in maximizing your payout? And then third, what is it that you want to do and how can we align what you want to do with maximizing your payout and meeting the buyer's needs? We've put together a very detailed sheet for you to be able to help create the criteria for your ideal post-transaction role. Step 1 is talking about what your value is to the buyer. And for right now, we're going to assume that it's a quality buyer. Oftentimes, the reason I put that in there is oftentimes people will say things like, well, what if the buyer is just not a good buyer to work with? Or what if the buyer doesn't have good, capabilities, etc. And we have to recognize that at a certain level, we don't know everything when we do a deal, but we still have to believe when we're doing our planning that we have a quality buyer on the other side of the table. Otherwise, we wouldn't exit with them. We'll verify that through due diligence. Then we want to talk about it from the lens of, even if you set up a role to work with a buyer for 2 or 3 years, I want to make the commitment to you that if you were going to work with Northbound, for example, we never link your purchase of the business payments to you having to stick on board. And the reason that you don't do that is because of the fact that you have tax implications of doing that, namely ordinary income versus capital gains. And fact of the matter is they're separate things. The buyer is purchasing an asset and they should pay for that asset. And then separately, they may be purchasing your time and efforts to help it succeed. So you don't need to confuse your role as if you say, well, if I sign up for working for 2 years and I only stick around for 1, does that mean that they'll come back after my purchase price? Now, as in M&A, there's always a caveat to every rule. If you sell your company and say you're going to work for 2 years and the Tuesday after the deal closing on Friday, the buyer can't find you, you are going to have some exposure. But in a general sense, these things are delinked. The second thing is if you're thinking about it from the lens of the buyer, the first priority that they always think about isn't how much growth can I get. It's what are the 3 biggest risks that I might have as a buyer that your expertise as a seller can help mitigate. And that might be supply chain, that might be other types of risks, but you want to document in this sheet what your ways are to mitigate the risk of a deal. Now, you'll start to notice that by doing this, you're also helping to craft the strategic conversation with the buyer, demonstrating your value to deserving of a premium valuation. And then the second priority is you want to then talk about the 3 highest value adds that you can provide. These would be typically things like continuing to bring out new products, or it would be to launching variation strategies into new niches, those types of things. Whereas Amazon case management would be probably something that would transition over to a buyer sooner. So first we say, what's our value to the buyer? Then what we do is we say, what's our value to us? And there's actually a couple areas of value here that I think that you might not have thought about that are critical to consider. The first one is you develop your plan based on it being worth your while, and recognize that when you sell your business, you're shifting from what I call the do everything CEO role to becoming a strategic advisor to the business. And a key note is this: a buyer just paid you life-changing amounts of money. What happens is if they're going to drive you 70 hours a week and you're not going to like your job, they know that if you don't like it, you're probably just going to not do it. And they're the ones that lose out because, once again, they've already committed to paying you a big sum of money. So recognize that when you're defining your role, you're going to be moving to being a strategic advisor, not being the ultimate do everything CEO. And then the second thing you have to look at is how much money do you have at stake, not just in the post-acquisition $5,000 a month or whatever it is that they might pay you, but if I've got $1 million on the table of hitting an earnout, I've got to really think about how much I'm being paid to make sure that this thing goes well. And then you want to start assessing some of the non-economic factors. These are some of the things that I don't think people think about. And they're things such as, what could I learn from the buyer about launching and optimizing products that I might be able to use in other business ventures that I go into? For example, if I sell out to an aggregator that is in 50 different brands, I'm going to learn a lot by going to meetings and being around that team about how do you deploy capital at large scale to do well. The other thing that you might learn is you might build relationships that help you in your career. Lots of people start out maybe at, again, using an aggregator as an analogy, but they decide to go off on their own. And just like a conference can be a future strategic partnership, so too can working with a buyer, as long as you recognize a key fact is that you will have non-compete and non-solicit provisions that you have to make sure that you adhere to. But outside of that, you can gain tremendous experience by deciding to work with your buyer for some period of time. And many sellers don't think about that value. The third one I always like to mention is that buyers deploy lots of capital. And so you can start to understand how a capital scaled business runs differently than one that does not have access to capital. Third, you want to then get outside of the benefit for you or them and start looking at other types of interests that you have in your life. The fact of the matter is many of you are exiting to be able to maybe not have to work as hard or as intensely. So you want to start thinking about things like, what's your plan for starting your next opportunity if there's going to be one? What do you think that it's going to take in order to identify the time period? And then beyond that, what downtime do you want to get and when? For example, many people think that they'd like to take the month after they exit off. And the reality is that's just not a very good idea to protect your own interests. You're going to need to stick through that migration. But that doesn't mean that you can't plan in advance to say, I'm going to work with the buyer intensely for 6 months. Then what I'm going to do is take a full month or two off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my next venture. So you want to be thinking about that well before you get in front of a buyer. Then you also want to think about, if I have a next venture, how much is it going to cost me to get this up and running? And is there a way that I can be a strategic advisor on my current business and maybe earn $5-6 grand a month, which is not that hard to negotiate, but that meets all of my needs so that the money I'm putting into my next venture doesn't have to come out of my living or personal expenses, or worse yet, the money that I just got from selling my first business. And then you want to think about, how much will the second or next opportunity pay you? Because the reality is you might have an opportunity that's a $30 million opportunity that you need to get going on right away. And if that's the case, you might have to design a different transition period than if you're like, well, I don't know, A, if I want to do something next, and B, I want to take my long, sweet time figuring out what that actually is. After that step, you can now start to define your ideal job description in each one of these phases: the migration role, the transition role, and then the long-term value creation role. And then once you think about it from that perspective, you go, I'm going to start out full-time. Then in my transition role, I'm going to define it based on the other steps that I have to do. And finally, in the value creation role, I'm going to determine if I want one at all. And if so, what do I want it to look like? After you've got your job description in place is the time that you can then start to break down the time allocation by quarter so that you have an understanding of how much time you're going to be committing to this business that you won't be able to commit to other things, business or personal wise. So hopefully you're seeing a very detailed and strategic way of thinking about a huge topic as it relates to going into your transaction. So the action item for this is going to be, take the time before you get in front of a buyer to define what your designed ideal action role would look like, and make sure you say, here's what I want to do for myself, here's what's most valuable for the buyer, and then here's what the time and duties are that I think I could best do to leverage my deal. Finally, you may be wondering, Scott, why even go through all of this process if I don't have a buyer in mind? And the answer is that while you'll still have to update it, it's a great exercise for you to help sort through. For example, do I even want to do a rolled equity deal if I want to leave right away and I don't want to leave chips on the table? Or maybe you love this business and you just want more capital to do it. Defining your personal goals and defining your post-acquisition role helps you sort through that scenario. Okay, now that we've defined our role, we come back to the topic of lane. Which buyer will tend to want to do my post-acquisition role? So the action item is to go through and prioritize 1 through 6 of which buyer would work best. And for example, if I want to stay on for another year or two after the acquisition to make sure it goes well, I can pretty much rule out row number 6 or column number 6, cash plus non-contingent, because there'd be no incentive for me to do that. Then you've got your roll down, you've got your lane down. The next thing you want to do is now come to your economics and design an example or ideal transaction role for this particular business. First, fill out this ideal transaction worksheet that we have in the workbook. As you can see, it breaks all of this down and shows you the purchase price, it shows you the multiple, and it shows you the percentage of your compensation in each area. And then second, I recommend that you put in economics that you feel very confident you can achieve, and start conservative and then work your way up as you meet with buyers and get more information, rather than the other way around. Many people will start out and say, well, I'll only sell my business if I can, sell for an 8x multiple guaranteed, and I need another 2x on top of that. And it's just not realistic. And you end up going through a lot of work. And then at the end of the day, you end up feeling like it's wasted because you never got an offer that was anywhere remotely close to what your offer is. Here's the final step in this is putting all three of those things together and seeing your initial transaction priorities likely in a new way for the first time. You'll have identified the buyer that's ideal and the transaction type that they like to utilize. You'll have looked at your post-acquisition role and defined in detail what you think you can do to help a buyer and also then help yourself. And you will have structured out a sample deal with realistic economics so that you can now start to see your deal over time. Put it all together and you'll have a balance for the first time being struck between knowing what your priorities are and then now also balancing that with being open to the multi-lane negotiations to maximize your valuation, your terms, and your risks. Here's what you've accomplished by going through this process. You've finally created a clear, eyes wide open framework based on solid strategy and financials for creating a winning transaction for you and a buyer. This is invaluable as we now move into the step of interacting with buyers to get offers and create that premium transaction. Here's the point. It's absolutely critical that even though you have premium options laid out that are your priorities, that you don't pick the right buyer or even the right deal structure until you analyze all buyers against all deal components. I've been through this way too many times where buyer number 4 became buyer number 1 and actually won the deal because we kept our clients open-minded and they came in at the last minute with an offer that quote unquote you couldn't refuse. So even if you think you know what you want, you're only hurting yourself in the negotiation process if you narrow in on this too early. Having your initial transaction priorities set in advance prior to meeting with buyers is a critical step toward feeling confident as you go through the transaction process. And while it's critical to document them, it's even more important to then wait and let the buyer, or what I like to say, the process or the game come to you to see how buyers' priorities align with yours, and then institute your negotiating framework to get the premium valuation for your business. Thank you.